By this point in the course, you will have submitted the pitch for your digital artifact via a video post in your blog and reblog that to the subject blog. By now, you have picked a topic for your digital artifact and you are starting to think about the 3 concepts that you're going to be using to build an analytical framework for thinking about that game media, text or paratext. You're also going to be engaging in background research on the game, but also background research on those concepts and how you might employ them in the analysis. In order to build successfully on your pitch and prepare for the next milestone, the beta, you have to have a clear plan for your project, and that involves developing a timeline or a schedule for the remainder of the course. Some of you will have already developed your schedule for your pitch, and that's excellent. That's really great to see. But it's actually going to be expected to be part of the report on your progress in the project beta video that's due in a couple of weeks. In order to structure your project effectively, you need to have a schedule. A schedule is where you estimate how much time you are going to need to collect data, do background research, assemble your analytical framework, conduct the analysis, and produce the digital artifact. There are lots of moving parts of a digital artifact, so it's important to have a schedule that you clearly devote time to daily around your other obligations. Remember, as part of the digital artifact assessment, we're looking for evidence of your ability to plan and develop a project over time. We're not just looking for the final result, but how you've gone about the process. It's totally fine for a digital artifact to change direction midway. That is totally okay. You can revise your topic, change direction, change media format. It doesn't matter. And you can do that at any stage as long as you document that transition, as long as your planning is demonstrated in your final submission and that you can show in your contextual essay why that change happened, how you managed it, and how your planning responded according to that change. Another requirement of the digital artifact that we're looking for evidence of in the beta is your ability to demonstrate public feedback on a prototype. A prototype in this instance can be quite varied. Your prototype might be a version of a script for a video essay, a super early draft. It could be weekly engagement from an Instagram. It could be early designs of a game. It could be initial streams from your Twitch channel or a couple of test posts for your video essay. It could be the first episode of your podcast. We're going to workshop this, of course, in the tutorials, but you need to take account of public feedback and how you're going to get public feedback in your schedule. I really want to emphasize this next point. The feedback is about quality over quantity. In the past, students have great success with their pitch video going viral and getting huge numbers of likes and views and responses on Reddit. And that's great, but we're not actually assessing that. I'm much more interested in the evidence that you show of responding to feedback and at least thinking about that feedback in the iteration of your digital artifact. Maybe you simply say, oh, that's great feedback, but I can't quite see how I'm going to implement that, or that isn't quite the direction I want to go in. That's totally fine. But we're looking for evidence of the engagement with the public audience outside of the class in some way. Well, it could be just posting ideas to Facebook and getting some response. It doesn't really matter. It's about the quality of your engagement with that feedback. Another element that you have to prepare for and think about for your digital artifact and make time for in your schedule is playing. Now, I mean playing in its most loose and paidic sense here. If you're looking at a particular game on a particular platform and you have access to it, that's great. And you need to plan to play that game under specific times of investigation. But when I say play, I mean it in its true playful sense. I mean immersing yourself in the culture of the game text. This can be a bit tricky if you are analyzing an older game, a game from the 70s, 80s, 90s, or early 2000s that isn't available on the platforms that you have access to currently. There are a couple of ways you can go about playing with these texts. Sometimes you can get access to older versions that run on new systems, like through platforms like Good Old Games. They have a lot of older games that will run on current systems. Then, of course, there are emulators. So if you want access to older Game Boy games or even some DS games, you can run emulators on your PC that will give you access to those games. Sometimes you have to make deal with remakes. There are lots of remakes out there, and we'll come back to remakes in a later lecture. Another way to go about it is to watch video streams. YouTube and Twitch are both great sources where you can watch people play. This is obviously going to create a particular type of analysis, and you're going to be limited in the types of data that you can get access, but it's a totally legitimate way to collect data in order to analyze the text. If it's a paratext that you're looking at, you're going to need to spend time looking at communities of interest around that text, particularly, cosplay communities, if that's what you're focusing on. If it's merchandise and you're looking at, then you've got to really explore, how to get access to that. There'll be Facebook groups, right? There'll be Amazon pages, there'll be eBay pages, and that kind of thing. It's really important that you think and plan how you're going to access the game. Another part is that you're going to be collecting data. So you have to schedule time to play the game in a more scientific manner. That is, recording and capturing data about the experience. I'm going to talk more about how to do that in a second. This is not just sit down and play the game. Rather, setting aside a specific amount of time to take stock of exactly what you have to do in order to play that game, taking stock of its formal elements and playing the game critically rather than for entertainment or relaxation purposes. I want to unpack that a little bit. So it is not enough simply to play the game. In order to analyze a game, you need to conduct research into the game's context, but also conduct research into your analytical framework. If you're developing a feminist approach to understanding the representation of women in a particular video game franchise, let's say Final Fantasy, you're going to have to do research not only on Final Fantasy, but how academics and scholars working in feminist theory have dealt with the issue of representation across all types of media. Arguments about how women are represented in movies, television, comic books are all important to thinking about how representation works in video games, but it's not limited to that. So don't be restricted to just looking at research about video games. You can draw on the entire gamut of media and communication disciplines in order to help build your analytical framework. Obviously, news media, the web, social media are going to be a great source for researching the game's context. But don't be frustrated if you can't find the specific thing about the specific game. You can expand your search into related concepts. Often the research that you want, particularly in terms of video games, doesn't exist yet or doesn't exist in the way that you want. So you have to do parallel research and you have to find material that assists your argument, helps you think about the wider context in which the game was created, distributed, and received in order to build up the material for applying your analytical framework to. Folks know how to do, basic Google searches, but we'll look at in the tutorials, how to dig into more kind of research into history and philosophy and theory. If this is all new to you or if you're unsure, please make time to contact your tutor via Twitter, direct message. Another great resource is library staff. The library staff are totally keen to support your learning, and you can book a consultation time and they will help you find resources. We're also going to be looking at this research process in the tutorials, and I'm going to move on in a second, but I really want to just emphasize before we move on that don't get too focused on limiting your research to the game or the game media text itself. One way you can expand your analysis is to look at what's happening politically, culturally, socially, economically in the background. If the game is published in 2014, what's going on in 2012, 2013? What's happening in the background that's leading up to the production of that game? Another point I want to make here is, don't fall into the trap of just focusing on the game as part of your analysis. For example, if you're researching a mobile game, don't limit yourself to just the game. Look at how people use mobile phones generally. Look at the difference between mobile phone users in different countries with different telecommunications infrastructures. Look at the mobile use in different age groups, different plans and types. For example, people who can't afford plans with lots of data might not play online, connected games. They might play solo mode games on their phones. Look at the types of games that are being played on different brands of phones. Research critical essays on mobile technologies, uses, and other types of mobile phone use that can be brought in to thinking about your game analysis. Is there a correlation between the way people use a particular game and the way they use other apps? Is there a connection between the content of that game and other media? If you only focus on research about the game itself, you'll limit what can be said about the game, both in a purely structural but also post-structural way. Unless you broaden your research, you will reduce your overall understanding and therefore the potential argument about the dimensions of the game, its broader elements, its context, its production, its distribution, and reception. Playing critically should also be part of your plan and your schedule. If you are enjoying a game, there are going to be times where you just want to savor it. However, in order to capture useful data to analyze, you're going to want to be systematic, scientific, and schedule your time to take notes and focus on the game with forensic detail in order to play critically. This involves documenting your experience. You need data and evidence in order to reflect on that experience and examine the affordances and constraints of the game and the choices that you made personally as a result of that experience. Playing critically means collecting data, analyzing that data, and then using your analytical framework to produce that critical view. This is a kind of ethnography, most normally known as participant observation. One of the oldest methods for ethnographic research is the field journal. The term field simply means the area in which you are participating. So a game's field is, of course, the game itself, but also its paratexts. So even if you're not studying a game paratext, you need to be aware of the paratexts that it does have. When you're doing your research, this should involve looking at the game's official webpage, its wiki, its subreddit. You should look at the merchandise attached to that game. You should see whether there are mods and cheats available. Also, attention to the game's advertising, its packaging, and what its developers have said about the game. I'll come back to that in a sec. I just want to really highlight the idea that the journal is a super important part of the game analysis, and it can actually be a foundation for your digital artifact. So you might be doing an Instagram feed. You might be doing a podcast or a live stream or a series of blog posts. Think of these in a kind of weekly episode or edition or issue, or even daily notes that are not necessarily the final version of what you want to present as your digital artifact, but collectively they might form it. These can be, kind of rough notes about updates to your play experience over time, what you focused on during that play experience. Like, okay, this time I'm going to look at controls. How do controls work in this game? Okay, this time I'm going to look at sound design. Okay, this time I'm going to look at how the game makes me feel. And you can keep a concise record of your play experience in your journal. Now, we'll be looking for evidence of your field journal in the beta presentation, and it should feature prominently in the final contextual essay for your digital artifact and as material for your game analysis directly. As I said, the field journal should capture a range of different types of information, starting with the overview of the game, then looking at its formal elements, and then starting to build more detailed reflections about gameplay and the types of affect and emotion that accompany that experience. As you progress, try to focus not on recording everything. It's not about quantity, it's about quality. You can play for half an hour or do some research for half an hour and then sit back and think, okay, what is the most important element of that session? What was the most remembered moments? Don't worry about trying to capture everything at once or detailing every single part of it. Just try to take stock of your mood and your thoughts before and after play and document the difference. Remember, I'm not really interested in your opinion about the game, but I am interested if you thought the game was fun or boring, right? What were the moments of frustration? How did the game lead to an elevated sense of affect through elation and catharsis? Where was it frustrating and why? Where was it really building your adrenaline and why? And then think about that in relation to the formal elements and the overview and the affordances and constraints of that game. Collecting evidence is really important. Please do not underestimate the power of screenshots. Screenshots are really useful means of collecting data. Screenshots can be recorded on most devices, whether they're PC, desktop, laptop, or mobile devices. Most consoles have a screenshot function these days, but even a photo of the screen. Particularly if you're looking at board games, right? Particularly photos or role-playing games, or whatever. Photos are essential. And, your digital artifacts should be highly mediated evidence of your play experience. So ultimately, what's super impressive in this area is, of course, video capture and streaming. We've seen a couple of, Twitch streams and YouTube stream, Facebook, Mixer. There are dozens of ways to stream and capture with some technical challenges to overcome, but not overly difficult and nothing that you can't figure out with watching a couple of YouTube videos. So there are dozens of ways to create regular content updates for your digital artifact and have material that you can then engage a public audience with. One of the advantages in this course of not being familiar with games and not choosing a game media text that you are a fan of is the ability to maintain or produce a critical distance. A journal is useful because it helps provide data that you can analyze and reflect on at a later date. A journal is useful for capturing your feelings and emotional responses to a text and integrate them effectively into a critical analysis. Recording your experience can help you to step back from that experience and consider how that experience helps you to make sense of the text in a methodological way. How do your responses to the structure of the experience help you to think about the broader context of the game? How did it also limit your analysis? These kinds of questions are useful in helping you coherently structure a logical and organized argument about the experience of the text. It's also crucial to remember that your view is one among many. Someone else with a different background, playing in a different way, in a different time, in a different place, on a different platform, will make sense of the text differently. And that's why attention to your own player context is important in the analysis. It's registering that bias and actually making use of that bias in the analysis itself. Who you are, what your background is, how your situation works to structure your experience of the text and how you make meaning of it are super important to an effective critical analysis. But you have to register it, you have to think about it, you have to make sense of it for you and your audience. Critical distance also means that you can't make broad generalizable claims about the text. Only specific claims about your experience and the way you make sense of it by drawing on research and passing this data through an analytical framework. And so this is where research comes in, and other people's perspectives will contribute to your critical analysis and help support the intellectual rigor of your claims. The technical term for this approach is called phenomenology. This is actually a field of research that studies human experience and involves calling attention to what it means to be conscious of and alert to in our own bias and subjectivity. This means that we understand both our similarity to and difference to others. And we attempt to bracket it for the audience, to draw attention to our bias in a critical examination of the objects under investigation. So as I conclude now, just a couple of things that I want to point out, a couple of resources that might be useful to you in building an understanding of the context in which your game media text operates. The first is packaging, game boxes. In the past, before digital distribution, game boxes were a major form of advertising and marketing. Game boxes became major paratexts and containers for other types of game paratext, including things like manuals and discs, but also maps and other materials. This materiality has actually evolved into what we see into a very advanced marketing system now of the collector's editions and the ultimate editions and ways of repackaging content. These now include a range of paratexts that are really impressive. You get statues and art books and various other material objects. But this concept of the game box also applies to digital distribution, where you have the online stores, whether it's Uplay or Steam or whatever, and there's a page that has different types of material. They might have a clip of the actual gameplay. They might have a cutscene that's being used for promotion. They might have the ad that ran for the game. Also, now in this kind of virtual game box, right, there's going to be user reviews and critic reviews, achievements, and a whole range of other paratexts that are central to the cultural life of the game. Don't underestimate the importance of a good icon in the App Store, whether it's Android or Apple. And the iOS, right? A good icon that sits on your phone and pops out at you and gets your attention is massively important part of the lifespan of a game. Video game boxes were very important in the early years of the video game industry, particularly when the graphics of the systems were limited to the 8-bit, the 16-bit, and even the 32-bit era, the early 32-bit era. The artwork on these boxes and these paratexts were inspirational, and they contributed to the sense of theme, world, story, and narrative. Video game boxes were not only a way to show the player what to expect in terms of the graphics qualities of the game, they helped to set the stage for the imaginative realm of play that the game world existed in. They were aspirational, and they revealed much about the representationality and the intertextuality and the broader context and media realm in which they were created. Connected to this idea, of course, is press releases, news articles, and of course, advertising. Like box covers, video game advertising is a hugely rich paratextual resource and set of materials for your game analysis. There are multiple levels now of advertising, from, of course, print and material magazines to web page pop-ups. And then there's, of course, the whole AdSense, right? There's the whole Google advertising. And then there's advertising on Instagram, Facebook, YouTube. But there's also still bus advertising and billboard advertising. The examples on screen are an example of the way in which women have been used to, and the representation of women have been used to sell games, particularly in the 1990s and the early 2000s. And that has dramatically changed in recent years, although there is still an element of that in the advertising industry. Another major resource that's going to be super important that are actually paratextual components of video game and the video game industries since even probably the late 70s and early 80s, and that is reviews. Now, you're not doing a review, you're doing an analysis. And so reviews are important data points to help you build that analysis, whether it's in print journalism or radio, podcasts. Reviews went online in the late 1990s, and game reviews is now a major YouTube genre in its own right. The Internet Archive, archive.org, is actually a super useful resource for tracking down reviews of games from the 90s onward, and it can be useful in exploring the broader context of what's going on in terms of your game media text at the time it's being developed, particularly in terms of, if it is a franchise that has stuck around, like Doom, for instance, or even Pokemon. It is useful to research the context of the times in which the game was produced, and Wikipedia has a great function where you can look up a particular year, and it gives you a monthly kind of itemized link to events that were going on at the same time the game is being produced. Finally, another source of information is known as developer diaries, industry talks, interviews, and there's a term called the post-mortem, where the developers will actually provide a detailed account of the experience they had while making the game and the types of challenges. These can be found on blogs. There's a number of podcasts dealing with this, and some of them are linked in the Moodle, but also YouTube. And there are big events, GDC, the Games Developer Conference, where people will actually present detailed lectures on their post-mortem experience of their game. And that's super important. And we may actually look at some of those in the tutorial. So that's it from me this week. I know there's a lot to absorb there with the 2 parts. The emphasis in terms of the work on your DA this week is really locking down your schedule and planning out your DA and having a really solid foundation to move forward. Thank you very much for playing.